Everyone. Welcome to week 10. Today we're going to be going over more JavaScript and specifically handling events and conditionals. So just some announcements. Homework 9 was due before class today. Just as a reminder, if you want to submit your homework after the due date or like the deadline, you'll still get like half credit if you like get full marks. So you'll just get like you'll be penalized 50% of whatever grade you get. And homework 10 has already been released. It's on the Notion page and is due this time next week. Lab 10 has also been released. That's due on Friday at midnight as usual. Please note that there is no lab on Thursday because of Veterans Day, but we'll be posting a lab walkthrough in place of like in-person lab. And yeah, feel free to come to office hours for help on this lab as well. And yeah, just please note that we like a lot of the TAs have experience like going into office hours and then no one showing up. So then we don't really know if office hours are useful. So please like email for the people that mentioned on their Piazza index page that they'd like to be emailed in advance. Please like make sure you do that so that we kind of know if our office hours are going to be used or not. But yeah, okay. So one last thing, we have our final project that has their check-in due next Thursday. That's kind of similar to the check-ins for midterm projects where you kind of show us your design and then we give you guys some feedback. And yeah, the whole project is going to be due November 30th. I believe that's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So just be wary of that. And yeah, you can also check out our showcase website that's linked here. We'll like post the slides later and then you can find the link here if you want some inspiration. And yeah, and I know we've said this many times in the past, but we're finally like going to be releasing the grade updates or reports tonight. And that should include all homework that you've submitted, like at least up to week 8, maybe week 9 if you've submitted it earlier, and the midterm project. So you should have like a good estimation of how much work you need to do in the remaining part of the class to pass. And just as a reminder, you do have to do the final project to pass the class. But yeah, okay, so here are just a few memes about coding. JavaScript is definitely the hardest part of this class. And for people who don't have a CS background, it's a very tough learning curve. So yeah, don't be too discouraged if you're having a hard time so far with JavaScript. Yeah, okay, so today we're going to be basically, as I said earlier, talking about handling events. And this is basically when the user clicks on a button, a link, an image, or even like hovering your cursor, basically a user doing something, and then your JavaScript will change the HTML and CSS of your page to reflect that change. Yeah, so the first thing we'll do is going through a bit of review of what we covered in JavaScript last week. So you might remember, and also in lab, that we've been using this get element by ID method. Just for the sake of time, I won't be like, I'll just like tell you what this returns. So basically this should return an object representing the element whose ID is food list. And you'll notice here that when we pass in food list here, you do not want to include the hash that is associated with an ID because basically the method get element by ID already knows that you're going to be passing in an ID object. So that's why you don't see a hash here. Whereas you'll see here, oh, actually, this is also just one minor variation. You'll see the difference between these two lines is just the first word, let, and var. It basically means the same thing. So if you go online and you see like people using var for get element by ID or let, it means the same thing. But yeah, so you'll see here that we're using the query selector method instead. And that most importantly will return the same thing as the get element by ID. But you'll notice here that we do include the hash in this case because query selector doesn't know that you're returning, that you're querying a ID element, because you could theoretically could also include like class elements, for example. So that's why you have to include a hash to let the method know that you're referring to an ID element. And the one special thing about query selector is that it's a bit more versatile than get element by ID, because you could theoretically be referring to elements that are not IDs or classes. So yeah, things like H1, those could be referred to as well. And yeah, so this is another thing that we use in lab, I believe. This gets the list of classes of the HTML element that's assigned to food. And this should add the class foo to the HTML element food. Yeah, this is kind of stuff that you should have been looking at in lab, so this should be pretty familiar. And this is just removing the class bar from the class list of food. Yeah. Okay, so now on to some new content for today. We're going to be talking about DOM and event handlers. And DOM basically stands for Document Object Model. So you can see here that basically when an HTML page is loaded, JavaScript, what it will do is it has this representation of your entire web page that is made up of objects. And most importantly is each HTML tag is going to be an object. So in this case, you'll see body. Body is the HTML tag that you include everything inside. That's going to be an object. And then H1, like heading 1 could be an object. And in this case, the unordered list with the ID food list is going to be known as an object as well. Yeah, and this was like a question that popped up in office hours for me recently. Like, what is document when you do like document dot get element by ID? Well, basically that's basically like the keyword that you want to use the functions like get element by ID and create element. So if you omit the word document, then it's not going to know what those functions are. And yeah, so basically what really happens when you use this method, for example, is you're going to be going through the entire DOM, the document object model, and finding the element that has the ID food list. I think this is an error here. This would be like hashtag food list. Yeah. Oh, okay. I think when I was editing the slides, I flipped them. So basically in this case, we've been using get element by ID before, but one thing that we haven't used that you might also find online is get elements by class name. And you'll notice here that class, as we've like talked about before, refers to like multiple elements that could have the same class. So that's why you'll have get elements, like the plural. Make sure you don't forget the S when using this method. And when you use this method, it'll find all elements that have the class dot food. So in this case, just imagine this model here for get elements by class name food, and the get element by ID would be in this case. And yeah, for this unordered list, you would also have like smaller objects for the HTML tag li. So yeah, okay. So one thing to note is JavaScript is event driven, and basically what this means is that the whole like purpose of JavaScript and the way we're using it is to deal with events from the user. So we can define events here as actions that you take as a user when you're interacting with a web page. So things like hovering over certain elements, clicking on things like hyperlinks, or even typing. These are all different types of events that JavaScript can handle and edit your HTML and CSS of your web page accordingly. This is kind of just an example of that like event-driven nature. You don't need to worry too much about this. This is basically just showing that you have these events that you could theoretically test. and your web page is going to be able to handle these kinds of events. So yeah, okay. So the important thing about JavaScript is when we handle an event, we can change different elements on our screen. So you might have been asking this question to yourself earlier, like what's the difference between using JavaScript to handle events and things like pseudo selectors? Because in the past, pseudo selectors is like most relevant with CSS. We've done things where we're like handling your cursor hovering over something or clicking on something, and you're able to change CSS. Well, basically, what JavaScript introduces is that you're able to change different elements on the screen instead of just that one element that the pseudo selector is written for. So you can kind of see here on the right, you have the whole DOM model. And when an event occurs, you could theoretically change the CSS for H1 and LI. So yeah, so every the important thing to know is every DOM element object has an onClick function. So this onClick function is just like an example of one of the default behaviors that JavaScript is going to be able to deal with. Yeah. And you'll see here that, well, you see here on the bottom, button element.onClick, we're going to be assigning show greeting to it. And in this case, show greeting is a function that we wrote above. And you're going to notice that we do not want to include the parentheses after show greeting. If you come from a CS background, you're probably going to recognize that when you include these parentheses, that's going to be calling the function. And the important thing to know is we do not want to call the function right now, because if we're calling the function like immediately, then when you load the web page for the first time, then the JavaScript's going to immediately call the function instead of waiting for that specific event, which in this case is the button element on click from happening. So yeah, the important thing to know about this is we don't want to call show greeting straight away. We basically just want to tell the browser that this is the function that we want to use when this element takes place. And as I kind of mentioned before, there are other event handlers that that DOM elements can have. So before we had the onClick one, in this case, we have on mouse over. You can also have like on key press or on click. Yeah. And yeah, okay. So one important thing to know is we don't always have to define the function with a name. So you'll see the difference between these two pieces of code on these two slides is that on this slide, we're defining the alert howdy function as like by giving it a name show greeting. Whereas in this case, we're going to be we're going to have the same function, but we're not going to give it a name. We're just going to assign it straight away to the button element on click event. It basically the function, the behavior of this code is exactly the same. You just won't have the function name. And this is basically known as an anonymous function because we're not giving it a name. Yeah, so this is kind of delves a bit deeper into using anonymous functions and modifying CSS. So in this slide, we're changing the background color of the element with ID box. So you can just imagine on your HTML page, if you have a section on your web page and you've called it like ID box. And in this case, we're going to be, when we click on this button, we're going to call the change color function with the string red. And the change color function in this case is going to be assigning red, which in this case is assigned to the variable color, to the box element dot style dot background color. So this is kind of combining everything that we've talked about so far. So you have an anonymous function at the bottom, because this like calling the change color method isn't like really like extremely important to have its own name. So we just gave it an anonymous function, and this function, which could be used multiple times, that's why we have a name for it, is gonna assign the string that you pass in for color to the background color, the style background color of the box element. Yeah, so like one thing to note about this is you might remember when you're when you're messing around with the CSS of elements, you could theoretically have the background color equal to red, and that's why we just pass in the string red here. But more importantly, whenever you want to change the CSS of an element through JavaScript, you always want to use the dot style keyword. And that is basically shown, yeah, I basically jumped ahead a few slides. But we basically want to use the style dot property keyword here. Property in this case is replaced by background color because the property we're messing around with is the background color. So yeah, make sure you don't forget the dot style keyword when you're changing the CSS of, in this case, box element, which we defined up here. And yeah, so one important thing to note is a lot of this stuff with JavaScript, it's very hard to memorize everything. So, and this is something that I've experienced in office hours a lot. It's very useful to just Google like basic questions about JavaScript. So in this case, we're searching up like, how do I change a CSS property with JavaScript? And I actually Googled this when I was preparing for this lecture. It basically goes through some examples of what we just talked about. And yeah, so feel free to like Google questions that you have there. Stack Overflow usually answers a lot of the basic questions that help remind you how to do stuff. So, okay, so now we've finished talking about event handling in JavaScript. Now we're going to be talking about, I forgot the name, like handling conditions. Conditions, yeah. So the first thing to know about conditions are Boolean expressions. And you might have, okay, I'll quickly go through like what a condition is. So basically a conditional statement allows you to do different things based on the truthiness of a condition. The truthiness, basically, I don't know if this is like a widely used term, but it basically checks if a certain condition is true. And if it is true, then you want to do something. So there's some very useful operators that you might want to use when you're writing conditions in JavaScript. These are a bit different from other coding languages. So if you have a CS background, you might want to note that these operators are a bit different from what you might have seen in the past. So the three equal signs all put together basically compare two variables and make sure they're the same type and they're the same value. So the type and value are two different things. And this one where it's an exclamation mark and then two equals, that's kind of the opposite. It checks if the two variables don't have the same type and value, if that makes sense. And then you have the other relational operators that you probably have seen in like science classes or math classes. That's pretty familiar. So yeah, so these are some examples of using those operators. 1 plus 5 is 6, and 6 equals to 6 because it's the same type and the same value. So the same type meaning they're both integers, and the same value meaning they're both 6. Whereas in this case, 1 equals 2 is false because even though they're the same type, they're both integers, they're not the same value. Whereas in this case, 1 plus 5 is 6 is not equal to 2, but because we're using the negation operator, we're basically saying, does 6 not equal to 2 in terms of value and type? And that's true. So this evaluates the true. The important thing to know with these like Boolean expressions is that there are only going to be 2 possible values, true and false. So when you write a conditional statement, the expression inside the statement can only evaluate to true or false. So you want to take like ensure that your code covers the behavior of those 2 situations. Yeah, so the next thing to know, the next useful thing to know about conditionals are the logic operators. So in this case, you have and or and not. We've kind of seen not before. That's like the negation operator. The 2, this is kind of like easier to remember. You have the 2 ampersand symbols. They always have to come in 2, and that represents and this is kind of harder to remember, but the 2 like vertical lines are equal to or. I believe that's like the key above your return key on your keyboard. Yeah. So and basically means that both conditions, actually, sorry, I'll backtrack a little. These logic operators are basically used when you want to combine 2 different conditions to form one big condition. So in this case, and will only evaluate to true when both conditions, or it doesn't have to be like 2, it can be 3 or more, but you'd have to like include the logic operators between each condition. And basically will only evaluate to true when all the conditions, in this case, there are 2, evaluate to true. So you see here, false and false equals false, true and false still equals false, and only true and true will equal to true. Or is a bit different. It will return true as long as one of the conditions that you included is equal to true. So you'll see here in the first line, since we have one of them equal to true, then the whole expression evaluates to true. In the second one, there are no trues, so the entire expression evaluates to false. And in the third case, there is at least one true. In this case, there are 2 trues, so the entire expression evaluates to true. We've kind of covered this already, like the negation operator, it just reverses whatever the expression is inside. So if you have a true expression and you negate that, then that's going to evaluate to false. If you have a false expression, and you negate that, it's going to evaluate to true. So yeah, okay, so this is kind of a practice of all the operators that we just covered. For the sake of time, I won't ask what this is going to return. I kind of like added the answer here. So you can see here that 1 plus 2 does equal to 3 in value and type. They're both integers. 1 plus 3 is equal to 3. And since 3 is equal to 3, the values match up. So you have a true in this case. On the right, you have 5 times 6, which is 30. 30 does not match 31, even though it matches it in type. It does not match it in value. Yeah, so you'll have true and then the and symbol and then the negation, because we haven't really evaluated that yet, and then false. So yeah, so like the important thing to know about things